Hi, I'm Sushant and welcome to this online tutorial by Quest. This tutorial is a continuation in the series on neuroanatomy. If you have not watched the previous video, I would recommend that you do so before proceeding. In this tutorial, let's focus our attention on the sensory tracts that are of relevance in clinical neurology. For our sensory nerves to collect impulses, we need organelles that convert various forms of stimuli into action potential. This is done by the receptors. Once action potential is generated, axons within the spinal nerves carry it towards the spinal cord. Nerves can be classified on the basis of their diameter, on the speed of carrying impulses, and whether or not they are covered by a myelin sheet. Axons that are covered with myelin are faster transmitting and usually larger neurons. Such larger myelinated neurons carry sensations of touch, pressure, proprioception, and vibration. Pain and temperature sensations are carried by smaller and mostly unmyelinated axons. Cell bodies of these axons are in the dorsal root ganglion, situated on the posterior root of each spinal nerve. Remember, cells in the dorsal root ganglion are pseudobipolar cells, and they would give one process into the CNS to transmit impulses higher up into the brain. Hence, the sensory tracts that we are going to talk about, they begin with the axons of the cells in the dorsal root ganglion. Apart from sending the stimuli towards the brain, the sensory pathways that enter through the posterior root of the spinal cord would also send a copy to the motor cells which are sitting in the anterior horn of the gray matter at the spinal cord. This copy of the impulse helps us to act fast. This is especially important when we have a strong or a harmful stimuli. Such an action, which is mediated at the spinal level, is known as the reflex arc. Damages to the sensory system can therefore interfere with reflexes like the deep tendon reflexes. Now, moving our attention towards the sensory tracts, there are two tracts of importance to us. First is the posterior column tract, and the second are the spinothalamic tracts. You might know that the spinothalamic tracts can be either lateral spinothalamic or anterior spinothalamic tracts. Now, the posterior column tracts are responsible for carrying the sensations of touch, position, vibration, and pressure, while the lateral spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature sensations. The anterior spinothalamic tract carries deep touch, but this is of very little clinical consequence. Hence, for this discussion, whenever I am talking about spinothalamic tract, I am going to be referring to the lateral spinothalamic tract only. Now, there are some common features between both of these systems. Firstly, in either of the sensory tracts, there are going to be three neurons involved in transmitting the impulse from the level of the receptor up to the brain. We will call them the first, the second, and the third order neurons. Now, the first order neuron of both of these systems will have its cell body sitting in the dorsal root ganglion, and its peripheral process is going to be in the spinal nerve. As we have already said, the myelinated processes are going to be transmitting touch, position, vibration, and pressure, while the non-myelinated fibers are going to be transmitting pain and temperature sensations. In either of the systems, impulses are to be transmitted to the gray areas in the opposite side of the brain. And this crossing of the midline is going to be done by the second order neuron in both the systems. Also, though both systems are finally going to end at the level of the cortex, the second order neuron is going to end in a gray matter zone that is situated deep inside the brain. This area in the brain is known as the thalamus. The thalamus is the sensory relay station of our ascending tracts. Our third order neurons are going to arise from the thalamus, and from here they are going to project to different areas of the cortex. With this basic overview of how the sensory system works, let's turn to our first tract. This tract has its first order neuron carrying the sensations of touch, pressure, position, and vibration. And the first order neuron, as we already know, has its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. The central process from the dorsal root ganglion is going to enter the spinal cord via the posterior root, and it will start ascending upwards. That means it is not going to synapse at the level of the spinal cord, but its fibers will start moving towards the posterior column, which is the white matter of the spinal cord. This is called the posterior column tract. This is carrying the sensations from the same side of the body, and it is going to ascend upwards right up to the level of medulla. If I see a transverse section of the spinal cord, these fibers are going to be situated peripherally. Therefore, any external compression of the spinal cord tends to involve the posterior columns quite early on. As we move upwards from the sacrum towards the cervical region, newer fibers are going to enter into these posterior columns. Therefore, the sacral fibers are going to be arranged medially, and the upper fibers will get arranged lateralwards, such that the cervical fibers are the most laterally situated fibers in the posterior column tract. When this posterior column tract reaches the medulla oblongata, its first order neurons are going to end in the nuclei of gracilis and cuneatus. From here, the second order neurons will arise. They will cross the midline in what is known as the sensory decussation. These cross fibers are then going to be organized in a ribbon-like fashion, and they are going to be sitting close to the midline. Hence, they will be called medial lemniscus. Remember, from medulla upwards, these fibers are carrying sensations of the opposite side of the body. The medial lemniscus will climb upwards in the medulla, the pons, the midbrain to finally reach the thalamus. From the thalamus, the third order neuron would arise, and that would reach to the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Focusing our attention on the spinothalamic tract, this is also a 3-order neuron. The first order neuron is going to carry pain and temperature sensations via unmyelinated fibers. Its cell bodies are in the dorsal root ganglion, and they will give a central process that will enter through the posterior root of the spinal cord. But unlike the posterior column tract, the first order neuron of the spinothalamic tract is going to end at the level of spinal cord. It is going to synapse in the posterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord at the level of its entry. A peculiar aspect of this neuron is that in some cases, the fiber might climb up 2 to 3 segments to enter the posterior horn at a slightly higher level. Now, when the first order neuron ends, the second order neuron emerges from nucleus proprius in the posterior horn of the gray matter. This second order neuron will cross the midline and ascend upwards in the lateral columns of the opposite side. This is called the lateral spinothalamic tract. The crossing fibers are going to pass quite close to the central canal and are therefore at risk of damage due to lesions which are around the central parts of the spinal cord. As the spinothalamic tract ascends in the spinal cord, newer fibers are going to be added medially. Hence, the sacral fibers are going to be placed lateralmost and the cervical fibers are going to be placed medialmost in the spinothalamic tract. The spinothalamic tract would pass through the spinal cord, up to the medulla, through the pons, midbrain, and finally reach the thalamus. As these fibers are going to travel through the brainstem, they are again going to be arranged in a ribbon-like fashion, and there they are going to be known as spinal lemniscus. On reaching the thalamus, the third order neuron would start, and that would project to various areas of the cortex. Now, once we have understood the anatomy of posterior column tract and the spinothalamic tract, there could be a variety of applications to understand from this neuroanatomy. Imagine you have a patient who has one half of the spinal cord that is damaged, what is also known as hemisection of the cord. Now that would lead to a loss of touch, vibration, position sense on the same side of the body. And this loss would be occurring right at the level where there is damage and all the segments below that. But since the spinothalamic tract which is involved is going to be carrying sensations from the opposite side of the body, pain and temperature would be lost from the opposite side of the body. Also remember, the first order neuron of the spinothalamic tract could have climbed up 1 or 2 segments. So, patients might experience loss of pain and temperature that could begin actually 2 levels below the level of lesion. Now, lesions that would compress the spinal cord from outside, they are more likely to affect the posterior column tracts earlier than they are to affect the spinothalamic tract, while the lesions which start from the center of the spinal cord are more likely to affect the spinothalamic tract. In fact, lesions like syringomyelia might specifically affect pain and temperature while sparing touch, position, vibration. This is what is known as sensory dissociation. Now, central lesions are more likely to affect the cervical fibers of spinothalamic tract than the sacral fibers. This means patients are more likely to lose pain and temperature in the neck and the upper limbs before they are going to lose the same sensations in the lower limbs. This pattern of distribution on the neck and the upper limbs is what is known as the Cape pattern. Finally, lesions affecting the thalamus would lead to a loss of sensation of all types on the opposite side of the body. In fact, some of these patients might experience severe pain on the opposite side in what is known as Dejerin-Rossi syndrome. To summarize, we have seen that the afferent or the sensory tracts are 3 order neurons. The first order neuron arises from the dorsal root ganglion, the second order neuron crosses the midline, and the third order neuron arises from thalamus to reach the cortex. The posterior column tract is going to carry touch, position, vibration from the same side of the body. It is made up of the first order neurons. The spinothalamic tract is going to carry pain and temperature from the opposite side of the body, and it is made up of the second order neuron of that system. A variety of clinical presentations can be understood once we understand the anatomy of these tracts. If there are any questions, feel free to discuss with me on the Quest app. Thank you and Jai Hind.